People spend billions of dollars every year on things they hope will improve their quality of life. Plastic surgery, cosmetics, self-help programs, gym memberships, life coaches, and things like this. We want to make the best of our time here on Earth because that time is valuable to us. It's limited. But behind that desire is an assumption, and that assumption is that we are worth something. Human beings have inherent value and dignity. We see this in commercials and ads for different products, but that's natural. I mean, after all, manufacturers are trying to sell us something. But we also see human value somewhere else, and that is whenever we talk about rights. So, we talk about the right to work or the right to have access to affordable health care and other rights that are legally guaranteed to every American citizen, like the right to a fair trial or to be free from cruel and inhumane treatments or freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. The Declaration of Independence states that people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Modern people agree. We set up charities to provide for the needs of the less fortunate. We have shelters and soup kitchens for the homeless because they deserve better than to have to forage like animals. We give away clothing and other necessities because people have a right to a certain minimum quality of life. What many people today don't understand is that our modern concept of rights, like these, really springs out of a biblical worldview. Throughout history, we can see that human dignity was typically in short supply. It wasn't something that people just naturally assumed. Let's take a quick look at the evidence. Ancient Near Eastern literature tended to depict people in a somewhat negative light. Mesopotamian mythology portrayed humanity as a kind of afterthought. People weren't created by the gods with any particular nobility or purpose. In fact, they were created as servants designed to do the dirty work of the gods. And human beings had very few expectations that the gods would demonstrate benevolence or compassion. In Egypt, we do see some depictions of people being created by the god Khnum on a potter's wheel, but they didn't have any kind of extended account of humanity's creation like we see in the first chapters of Genesis. So, therefore, we're left to assume that they didn't really consider the creation of humanity to be especially noteworthy. Well, today we talk about the evils of cruel and inhumane punishment. This was not a conversation had by people in the ancient world. We can see one example of this in crucifixion. The Romans perfected this mode of execution after getting it from the Persians. This is arguably the most monstrous method of execution ever devised by the cruelty of man. Victims would hang on a cross, sometimes for days, praying for death. They would be stripped naked in humiliation while spectators could insult, mock, or spit on them. Centuries before, the Assyrians were no better. They had several different ways of killing people, including impaling them. And archaeologists have discovered stone reliefs that immortalize the brutality of the Assyrian army and its treatment of conquered peoples. But things didn't always turn deadly. In Egypt, a person could be beaten and imprisoned for not being able to pay his taxes, while his king, considered a god, lived a life of incomparable luxury and would have been buried with a fortune in gold, precious stones, and valuables. It might be tempting to say that in the 21st century, we're so much more tolerant and understanding. But before we start claiming that we live in a more enlightened age and that we've evolved as a species, let's look at some more recent examples. If we're so enlightened, why is it that only a century and a half ago we treated people like animals? This is a picture of a man known as Whipped Peter. How could any reasonable human being do this to someone else? In the 20th century, we've got other examples. The Nazis believed in the superiority of the German race. They blamed Jews for Germany's troubles and herded them off into concentration camps where many of them were killed in gas chambers, hanged, or simply worked to death. At the same time in Japan, there was a special section of the Imperial Japanese Army called Unit 731, who conducted gruesome experiments on civilians and Chinese prisoners of war, including performing vivisections on victims while they were awake and without anesthesia. Most recently, we've seen Islamic extremists killing those who don't share their worldview, including not only infidels, but also fellow Muslims they do not consider to be faithful enough. But it isn't just a problem of the religious. We could turn to secular countries to find things that are just as bad or worse. We know that groups like the Uyghurs and practitioners of Falun Gong are persecuted in China. And if that isn't bad enough, we also know that prisoners there are routinely killed for their internal organs, which are harvested and essentially used for organ transplants on demand. We like to think that we're advanced, and yet these horrific crimes continue. And yes, even in the West, we can have the same outlook on life that leads to these kinds of atrocities. It doesn't come from criminals or deviants. It is exemplified in the work of professors who are some of the world's most celebrated thinkers. Australian bioethicist Peter Singer believes that parents should be allowed to kill newborns who have observable disabilities. In his book Practical Ethics, he wrote, "Human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons. The life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, dog, or chimpanzee." When a woman tweeted that she didn't know what she would do with a child she knew would be born with Down syndrome, Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins said, "Abort it, start over. It would be immoral to bring a child like that into the world." Sam Harris is a celebrated militant atheist who once said, "Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them." In other words, some people believe things so dangerous that it might be necessary to preemptively murder them. You see, the problem isn't ancient cultures. It isn't non-Western cultures. The problem is people. Human beings don't seem naturally inclined to grant rights and privileges to others, especially to those who are different. And this is where the Bible comes in. The creation of humanity in the Bible is a high point in ancient literature. Ancient peoples did not spend a lot of time on the creation of mankind in their myths. People were destined to be slaves. The gods really didn't care about them. But in the Bible, man is created in the image of God as a special creation worthy of honor and respect. The Bible clearly places mankind on a higher level than what we see anywhere else in the ancient world. And it's no coincidence that the farther our society gets from God, the more human beings are devalued. Examples we could cite include abortion, viewing women as nothing more than sexual objects, and the awful treatment of people under militarily atheistic governments. In Genesis 1 and 2, we see that God creates people in his own image. They are designed to be loved. God gives them jobs, but not as slaves like what we see in the Mesopotamian myths. Instead, God intends them to serve as stewards or governors of his beautiful creation. He gives them exalted status. The Bible says that he created people to be a little lower than the angels. Other ancient religions viewed mankind as an afterthought, but God purposefully fashioned mankind as the pinnacle of his creative achievement. The value of human beings is most easily seen in the crucifixion of Jesus. In the ancient world, it would have been incomprehensible for any god to die voluntarily in the place of people who deserve the consequences of their actions. But Jesus did. God made people to be loved, and when they fail, to be redeemed. If you want to find the reason why we believe that people are valuable, why every single human being deserves a basic level of respect and dignity, and why every person should be treated fairly, we have no further to look than Genesis chapters 1 and 2, because those are just some of the perks that come with being made in God's image.